The flames licked higher, crackling against the night sky, and for a split second I thought I was dreaming. But no, it was real. My house was on fire, not because of an accident, not because of nature. No, the president of our HOA, a deranged woman drunk on power and petty vendettas, had tried to burn it down over a $5 fine. But what she didn't know was that I had been setting a legal trap for months, baiting her step by step into a cage she could never escape. Some people play petty games, others prepare for war. And tonight, war had arrived on her doorstep instead of mine. Have you ever watched someone dig their own grave, one smug shovel at a time? It started with a ticket fluttering against my front door, a garish neon slip pinned beneath a thumbtack so violently embedded into the wood that it splintered. The offense? A $5 fine for an unsightly decorative item, my garden gnome, a gift from my late grandfather, tucked tastefully among the hedges. It was absurd. It was laughable. And it was only the beginning. The paper practically vibrated with the smugness of its author, HOA President Karen Whitmore, a woman who treated our neighborhood like her personal feudal kingdom. I peeled the notice from the door with a slow, deliberate motion, feeling the first crackle of something dangerous flicker behind my ribs. I didn't rage. I didn't argue. I just smiled grimly and added it to the folder I had started 6 months ago, the one labeled HOA Violations, Evidence. That smile was the beginning of Karen's downfall. In the following days, the harassment escalated with mechanical precision. Another letter came, citing a dangerously unkempt mailbox post, though the only thing wrong with it was that it was 5 degrees off plumb. Barely enough to notice unless you were measuring it with a spirit level and malicious intent. 2 days later, another note. Non-standard lawn ornament. This time, it was a wind chime my mother had hung when she visited. A delicate thing that barely made a sound unless the breeze caught it just right. $5. Another find. Another piece of paper for the folder. The absurdity would have been comical if it hadn't reeked of something darker. Power exercised for its own sadistic pleasure. I refused to be rattled. Instead, I started documenting every single interaction with cold, legalistic precision. I installed discrete cameras covering the entire property, saved every email, every note, every passive-aggressive comment from Karen's little army of clipboard-carrying sycophants. She thought she was bullying me into compliance. What she didn't know was that she was stepping into a carefully laid web, every strand tied off with legal knots. The real storm began a week after the gnome incident. I came outside one morning to find a long, jagged scratch gouged into the passenger side of my truck, deep, deliberate. I reviewed the camera footage, but whoever did it had stayed just out of frame, a calculated move. I called the police, filed a report. Their response was a shrug wrapped in bureaucratic language. Without clear evidence, there's not much we can do. Probably just some kids. Kids, right. Kids carrying a vendetta that matched word for word the HOA complaint that my truck was visually disruptive to neighborhood harmony. It didn't stop there. A week later, my rose bushes, award-winning, painstakingly cared for, withered overnight. At first, I thought it was some freak weather, but closer inspection revealed the truth. Weed killer, sprayed deliberately at the roots. Again, I filed a report. Again, nothing came of it. Can't prove intent, the officer said, handing back my statement with the kind of hollow sympathy that fills quotas but not justice. Then came the tire. A clean, surgical slash across the sidewall of my rear driver's tire, deep enough to flatten it instantly but subtle enough that it could have gone unnoticed, until it failed catastrophically. Thank God I checked before driving to work that morning. And still, the local authorities waved it off. HOA disputes are civil matters, they said. Take it up with your association. I took it up with my association, all right. I took it up by adding each new incident, each new piece of evidence, each whispered threat and veiled insult, into my growing war chest. I didn't confront Karen. I didn't shout at the HOA board meetings where she presided like some manicured dictator, banging her gavel with smug authority. I nodded. I took notes. I let her and her minions think they were winning. Behind the scenes, I filed the necessary paperwork, quietly hiring a private investigator to look into Karen's past. I discovered to no surprise that her record was not as squeaky clean as she pretended. A few sealed settlements from former neighbors in her previous community, allegations of harassment, civil suits quickly paid off and buried, patterns, predictable patterns, just like the one she was repeating now, thinking she could bulldoze anyone who dared stand up to her, not realizing she had picked a fight with someone who knew how to build a battlefield beneath their very feet. Every time I attended a mandatory HOA meeting, every time she paraded her fake smiles and rattled off new aesthetic compliance initiatives, I saw it, the cracks in her facade, the overconfidence, the sloppiness. She thought the $5 fines, the slashed tires, the poison roses would break me down. She thought that I would eventually sell, move out, vanish, another victory she could frame on the wall of her ego. She was wrong. I didn't plant roots here to be uprooted by a petty tyrant with a clipboard. I planted them to withstand hurricanes. I watched as Karen orchestrated neighborhood patrols, sending her little army door to door under the pretense of ensuring property values. They issued warnings for trash cans left out 5 minutes too long, for children's chalk drawings on sidewalks, for grass growing an inch past the prescribed height. It wasn't about order. It was about power, about fear, about making examples. And if she thought she could make me her example, she was going to learn a very different lesson, one written in legal code and reinforced by courtrooms, not cowardice. I refined my trap carefully. Documentation was everything. Multiple redundant backups. Copies sent to trusted third parties. A chain of custody so clean it could survive nuclear scrutiny. I began corresponding with the HOA only in writing, forcing them onto the record. I took screenshots, time-stamped everything, preserved every scrap of evidence like it was gold. Because it was gold. Gold that would soon buy her downfall. And still, Karen couldn't help herself. The fines kept coming. The letters grew harsher, more aggressive. A threat of lien placement appeared next, citing unpaid $5 fines. A laughable sum on paper but a legal hammer if left unchallenged. I paid each one under protest, stacking the receipts like ammunition. I even printed them onto legal letterhead, each stamped and notarized, and sent copies back to the HOA with a polite note. Payment enclosed. Protest duly noted. Documentation retained. Every fine she issued, every petty violation she dreamed up, tied the noose a little tighter around her own neck. She couldn't see it. She was too high on her own invented power, too insulated by years of neighbors who grumbled but complied. I was different. I wasn't playing the short game. I was preparing for the moment when her hand slipped, when she overplayed her position so egregiously that even the local authorities, lazy, indifferent, complicit, would have no choice but to act. That moment was coming. I could feel it in the air, thick and humid like the stillness before a tornado tears the roof off your house. Karen thought she was winning. She thought she was wearing me down. She thought $5 fines and slashed tires and poisoned flowers were going to break me. What she didn't realize was that every ticket she stapled to my door, every veiled threat she uttered at those pathetic HOA meetings, every tiny act of sabotage she committed against my property, it all fed the furnace of something she could never control. I wasn't documenting just to protect myself. I was documenting to destroy her. And when the time came, I wouldn't just defeat Karen Whitmore. I would erase her from the neighborhood she had once ruled like a queen. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, out of necessity. Some things, and some people, need to be removed, root and stem, for anything healthy to grow. And the $5 fine pinned to my door was the first nail in her coffin. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that pretends to be calm, wearing a bright sky and soft breezes like a disguise over the rot festering underneath. I was inside, sitting at my desk, methodically compiling yet another batch of Karen's absurd notices into my growing archive of HOA tyranny, when the first alert buzzed across my security feed. Motion detected. Zone 3. Backyard. I clicked over without haste, already half expecting some squirrel or a drifting tree branch. What I saw instead made my stomach turn to ice. Karen Whitmore, in her full battle regalia of a pressed blazer and an officious clipboard, was stomping across my lawn flanked by two of her hand-picked HOA enforcers. A pair of smug, middle-aged men who looked like they had just graduated from the school of petty authoritarianism. No call, no email, no scheduled inspection, nothing. They were trespassing. Marching right across my property with the air of colonial invaders, pointing at my shrubs, my flower beds, even my back porch. Scribbling furious notes like they were gathering evidence for some kind of war tribunal. I rose slowly, a predator scenting the shift in the wind, and moved toward the back door without making a sound. I didn't rush. There was no need. My cameras were already capturing every step, every intrusion, every idiotic gesture they made. I reached the door just as one of them, a weasel-faced man in khakis and aviators, kicked deliberately at one of my irrigation heads, snapping it clean off the stem. Water gazered upward in a thin, frantic jet. I froze, hand on the doorknob, watching. They didn't stop there. Karen pointed dramatically at the side fence that separated my lot from the community park, a solid, regulation-approved structure built years before Karen ever seized power. I heard her bark something about sightline violations and emergency community access requirements, as if that justified what happened next. The larger of the two goons produced a crowbar from somewhere, God knows where he had been hiding it, and with an almost gleeful grunt, jammed it between the slats of the fence. With a savage jerk, the wood splintered apart. Another heave, and an entire panel gave way, crashing to the ground with a dull, hollow thud that echoed across the lawn like a gunshot. Property destruction. Open, deliberate, and smiling while they did it. I stepped outside, calm and silent as the grave, and cleared my throat. Karen turned first, her face morphing from smugness to something like irritation, like I was the one interrupting her day. "Ah, Mr. Reynolds," she called, her voice syrupy and insincere. "We're conducting an emergency aesthetic inspection due to multiple complaints regarding your property's visual impact on communal spaces." I said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch long and thin between us. The two men shifted awkwardly, but Karen stood her ground, chin high, tapping her pen against the clipboard with theatrical patience. "You have no right to be on my property without notice or consent," I said finally, my voice low and surgical. Karen's smirk widened. "Under subsection 12F of the Community Guidelines, the HOA retains authority to conduct emergency inspections without prior notice when community aesthetics are deemed at risk." She recited it like gospel, as if the words themselves would shield her from what was coming. I didn't argue. I didn't rage. I simply held up my phone and pointed toward the corner of the yard, where a slim black camera perched unobtrusively atop the fence post blinked its small red eye. "Smile," I said coldly. "You're all being recorded, every word, every action." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Karen's posture. It lasted half a second before she shrugged theatrically. "Record all you want," she chirped. "You can bring it to the next meeting. We're just doing our duty." Then she turned on her heel, signaling her goons to follow, and they sauntered off across my mangled lawn, leaving a trail of broken irrigation pipes, crushed flower beds, and shattered fence panels in their wake. I stood still until the last of them vanished around the corner, then turned and went back inside. The tremble in my hands wasn't fear. It was something colder, sharper, a kind of rage that didn't burn but crystallized into something lethal. I spent the next hour cataloging the footage, saving multiple copies, uploading to secure clouds, printing still frames with timestamp overlays. By the time I was finished, I had a case strong enough to bend steel. That night, I filed a police report. Not a complaint, but a criminal complaint, detailing the destruction of private property, trespassing and harassment, complete with stills, video links, and notarized statements. The officer who took my report tried to smother a grin when he recognized Karen on the footage. "You know," he said, tapping his pen against the desk, "you're not the first one to file something like this. Might not be the last either." I leaned forward. "Good," I said. "Make sure this one sticks." The next HOA meeting was a theater of farce. Karen, wearing a new floral blouse-like armor and surrounded by her board of bootlickers, opened the floor to community concerns with the faux cheerful energy of a politician on trial. I waited until the second call for comments before rising from my seat at the back of the room, deliberately slow, letting the murmur of conversations die down into a charged silence. I approached the microphone they had set up, my folder under one arm, a quiet smirk on my lips. Karen's expression twisted ever so slightly, but she pasted a smile over it like spackle on cracked drywall. "Yes, Mr. Reynolds," she said, sweet as arsenic. "Do you have something to share with the community?" I opened the folder and withdrew a still image. Karen and her thugs, crowbar mid-swing, the fence splintering under the force. I held it up for everyone to see, then pinned it neatly to the corkboard beside the podium. A few people gasped. Others leaned forward, squinting. Karen paled slightly. "For the record," I said into the microphone, voice steady, "this is what emergency aesthetic inspections look like under our current HOA leadership. Trespassing, vandalism, property damage. All without notice, consent, or legal authority." The room erupted into whispers, some angry, some incredulous. Karen clutched her clipboard like it might float her out of this disaster. "This is taken completely out of context," she snapped, but her voice cracked on the last word. I smiled coldly. "The video will provide the full context," I said, "including audio of you authorizing the destruction." I let that sink in, then added, "A police report has already been filed. Multiple counts with evidence submitted. Civil proceedings pending." The board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a balding man with trembling hands, actually removed his glasses and wiped his forehead. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then tried to laugh it off. "Let's not make a federal case out of a minor misunderstanding," she said, her voice shrill with forced humor. "Accidents happen." I tilted my head. "Accidents don't bring crowbars to emergency inspections." Another ripple of murmurs. Another crack in her armor. She realized too late that she couldn't bully or bluff her way through this. Not anymore. I didn't stay to watch the rest of the meeting dissolve into chaos. I had made my point. I had shown my teeth. Now it was time to sink them in. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt the first true breeze of freedom in months. Karen and her cronies thought they were invincible. They thought they could stomp through my life, through my home, without consequence. They were wrong. They hadn't beaten me. They hadn't broken me. They had simply crossed a line I had drawn months ago, a line they never even saw coming. Now it was too late. Now the game wasn't survival. It was annihilation. The legal trap was fully sprung. And Karen Whitmore had just stepped squarely into it, grinning all the while. It didn't take long for Karen's petty retaliation to morph into something far more dangerous. After the disaster of the HOA meeting, where I had publicly humiliated her with undeniable evidence of her trespassing and property destruction, the neighborhood chatter turned ugly, not against me, but against her. For the first time, the spell she held over our small, manicured suburb was cracking. People whispered at mailbox clusters, crossed the street to avoid her Range Rover, and some even pulled their yards from the absurd mandatory inspections she loved so much. Karen, for all her Botoxed composure, was losing control. And if there was one thing people like her couldn't handle, it was the loss of power. I knew it. I anticipated it. But even I wasn't prepared for how recklessly she would lash out once her empire began to crumble beneath her. It started with a flurry of passive-aggressive emails sent to the entire HOA distribution list, claiming certain members of the community were engaging in slanderous behavior against volunteers striving to protect neighborhood values. Nobody bought it. Then came the veiled threats, warnings about non-compliance fines for nebulous infractions, sudden visits from the HOA's so-called compliance officers, who lingered a little too long outside my property line, taking photographs, scribbling furiously on notepads. I documented everything, of course. Every visit, every email, every violation of personal space. I wanted her desperate. I wanted her to make a mistake so colossal that no judge, no lawyer, no sympathetic neighbor could save her. That mistake came on a night soaked in heat and rage, a night that smelled of sweat and gasoline. It was just past midnight when the first alert hit my phone. Motion detected, backyard, zone 5, the shed. I sat up in bed instantly, heart pounding but hands steady. Another alert. Then another. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, grabbing my phone and sliding through the security feed with clinical precision. There, caught in grainy black and white footage, was a masked figure creeping across my lawn. Small, stocky, moving with an awkward, almost furious energy. I watched, breath held, as the figure produced something from inside a large tote bag, a plastic canister, a rag, a lighter. The image blurred as they sloshed liquid around the base of the shed, moving methodically, like they had planned this for days. Then a flick of the lighter, a tiny sputter of flame, and suddenly the dry grass at the shed's edge caught with a whoosh, leaping upward, greedy and fast. I was moving before the fire could grow. Shoes jammed on, baseball bat in hand. I sprinted through the house and burst out the back door just as the smoke hit, thick and choking. The figure was already fleeing, stumbling over a sprinkler head, vaulting my low-back fence like a clumsy cat burglar. I didn't chase. I didn't need to. My cameras had captured everything. I dialed 911 with steady fingers, reporting the fire before it could swallow the entire shed, or worse, the house. By the time the fire engines howled down the street, red lights spinning across the neighborhood like a war siren, I'd already grabbed my emergency documents from the safe and was ready to go if necessary. Thankfully, the fire hadn't had time to spread far. A few scorched boards, some blackened lawn, and a melted garden hose. But it was enough. More than enough. The fire chief, a gruff man named Ortega, walked over after the flames were doused, his boots crunching over the wet ash. "We found accelerant," he said without preamble. "Gasoline." Whoever did this came prepared. I nodded grimly. "I have footage." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're going to want to send that to the fire marshal. Arson's a serious felony." I already knew that. Knew it down to my bones. When I pulled up the footage on my tablet, Ortega leaned in, studying the masked figure's movements, their build, their frantic energy. "You recognize them?" he asked. I hesitated, playing it cool. Not officially, but inside, my mind screamed, "Karen!" The figure's height, the way the shoulders hunched inward, the stiff gait like they were unused to manual labor, it was her. It had to be. She was desperate, reckless, humiliated. And now, finally, criminal. The next morning, I drove straight to the county sheriff's office and handed over everything. Full footage files, a statement, a property damage report, sworn affidavits from the firefighters on scene. And just like that, the machinery of real law, not HOA kangaroo courts, but the full weight of the state, began grinding forward. But I wasn't done. No, this was only the beginning. I had anticipated escalation. I had prepared for it. What Karen didn't realize was that while she was busy plotting my downfall, I had been quietly assembling an arsenal far more devastating than she could imagine. That same day, I contacted my attorney, Elliot Brooks, a man who had spent a decade dismantling fraudulent HOAs across the state with surgical precision. Together, we filed civil suits, one for destruction of property, one for harassment, one for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Then we filed a restraining order against Karen and her known enforcers, citing escalating acts of intimidation culminating in attempted arson. By the end of the day, Karen was served personally, a moment I caught on my porch camera as she stood slack-jawed, mascara smudged, clutching the stack of court documents like they were acid burning her hands. But even that wasn't enough. Oh no. I went deeper. Using the HOA's own publicly available financial disclosures, something most residents never bothered to read, I uncovered thousands of dollars in consultation fees paid to companies owned by Karen's relatives. Landscaping firms that never landscaped. Security companies that provided no security. Event planning businesses that charged thousands for community gatherings that never occurred. It was blatant embezzlement, hidden in plain sight behind a wall of boring paperwork. I compiled it all into a glossy, devastating report and sent it, anonymously, to the county's Department of Consumer Affairs. Then I forwarded a copy to the IRS. Because if there's one thing that burns even faster than gasoline, it's tax fraud. News travels fast in a neighborhood built on gossip and fear. Within 48 hours, the whispers were everywhere. People started demanding answers at the HOA office. Some neighbors who had once tittered behind Karen's back now openly criticized her on the community message boards. Where did our dues go? Why is the HOA being investigated? Is it true about the fire? Karen tried to do damage control, of course. She sent out frantic emails about false allegations and an attack on community values. She called an emergency HOA meeting, standing at the podium red-faced and furious, rambling about loyalty and privacy and legal threats. But it was too late. The cracks had become canyons. Her own board members, sensing the coming storm, began to distance themselves. Some resigned outright, citing personal reasons. Others started leaking internal emails, texts, conversations, all painting Karen as a tyrant, a manipulator, a thief. She had thought she was untouchable. She thought she could burn down my life without consequence. But the fire she set wasn't the one she needed to worry about. The real fire was coming now, slow, unstoppable, and cold as hell, and she was standing directly in its path. Karen's unraveling wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, methodical collapse, like a rotted tree creaking and groaning until gravity finally yanked it to the ground. It began the morning after the fire marshal's official report leaked, a tidy little document that confirmed what anyone with eyes and common sense could already see. Accelerant had been used. Human hands had lit the flame, and the act had been deliberate. No storm, no freak accident, just malice. Pure and simple. Karen panicked the only way she knew how, by grabbing the biggest bullhorn she could find and screaming victim at the top of her lungs. First came the HOA newsletter, a hastily assembled mess of half-truths and weaponized pity. Recent allegations against HOA leadership are a targeted attack by a disgruntled homeowner seeking to destabilize our peaceful community, she wrote, signing it with a flourish of self-righteousness. We must remain unified against malicious rumors. Remember, not everything you hear is true. She printed it on thick, glossy paper, like fancy stationery could somehow cover the stench of desperation. Copies littered every doorstep in the subdivision, tucked into mailboxes, shoved under doormats, but the neighborhood didn't rally around her like she expected. Instead, a new energy crackled through the streets, a quiet, hungry anger that had been simmering for years beneath forced smiles and neighborly small talk. It was Mr. Spand, Jensen from 2 streets over, who broke the silence first. He posted on the community forum, Karen fined my wife $250 for putting up a wheelchair ramp after her surgery, called it unsightly. Then Mrs. Alvarez chimed in. Karen tried to evict my son's service dog because it was too loud, even though it saved him during an epileptic seizure. Then dozens more. Pet owners fined for non-existent noise complaints. Veterans threatened with liens for flags of improper dimensions. Elderly residents humiliated for gardens deemed too colorful. Families harassed for installing security cameras that disrupted the blanks that in synopsis. Uniform visual landscape. Each story was worse than the last. And each story painted Karen not as a misunderstood guardian of order, but as what she truly was, a tyrant in tasteful heels. Within 48 hours, a petition to remove her as HOA president had gathered over 150 signatures, nearly double the threshold needed to trigger an emergency board vote. Yard signs sprouted up like defiant weeds. Dissolve the board. No more Karen. Take back our neighborhood. It wasn't just internal anymore. The local news caught the scent of blood like a pack of wolves. First, a short segment on the 10 o'clock news, showing footage of scorched earth where my shed used to be, paired with whispers of HOA corruption and financial misconduct. Then a bigger story. Small-town OA president, under fire for alleged arson, embezzlement, and harassment. I watched it unfold from my living room, arms crossed, heart steady. Not with glee, not with satisfaction, just inevitability. Karen made her first public appearance 2 days after the story broke, standing stiffly behind a podium hastily erected on the HOA clubhouse lawn. She wore a somber gray suit and dark glasses, as if trying to cloak herself in the dignity she no longer possessed. Cameras clicked. Reporters shouted questions. Karen's voice wobbled as she read from a prepared statement. claiming she was the target of a calculated smear campaign orchestrated by radical elements seeking to destroy community cohesion. She painted herself as a martyr, a defender of tradition besieged by anarchists. She even managed a few crocodile tears, dabbing delicately at the corner of one eye with a tissue so white it practically glowed. But no one bought it. Not after the footage surfaced. Not after the petitions. Not after the neighbors started speaking up in interviews of their own, recounting horror story after horror story of fines, threats, and years of silent suffering. And not after the sheriff's deputies arrived in the middle of her speech and served her, on live television, with criminal charges, attempted arson, reckless endangerment, trespassing, and vandalism. The cameras caught the exact moment Karen's world split apart. Her face froze mid-sentence, mouth half open, tissue suspended in the air like a flag of surrender. The deputy didn't wait for her to recover. He simply thrust the thick stack of papers into her trembling hands, muttered a flat, "You've been served," and stepped away, leaving her alone in front of a sea of flashing cameras. It was the moment the dam truly broke. That night, new footage surfaced. A leaked deposition, Karen under oath during a preliminary hearing, claiming, eyes wide and voice quivering, that she never authorized any emergency inspections on my property. The problem? My video recordings, clear as daylight, showed her issuing those orders directly, clipboard in hand, smirk firmly in place, perjury, plain and simple. And the court wasn't feeling merciful. The judge sanctioned her immediately, slapping her with a personal fine so massive it could have bankrupted a small business. When reporters confronted her the next morning, she broke down completely, shrieking about deepfakes and AI manipulation, before being hurried away by her exhausted, red-faced attorney. I stayed silent through it all. No interviews, no gloating, no public statements. I let Karen twist slowly in the wind, her lies and crimes choking the very air around her. I wasn't seeking revenge. This was never about revenge. Revenge is emotional, impulsive, sloppy. What I was building was bigger, colder, permanent, systemic reform, the removal of a disease, the dismantling of a structure that allowed tyrants like Karen to rise and rule without consequence. Every step I took was deliberate, every action calculated. I worked behind the scenes with a group of neighbors, drafting new bylaws that stripped the HOA board of unchecked authority. We lobbied the county to enforce stricter oversight on all residential associations. We brought in independent auditors to comb through years of financial records, not just exposing Karen's crimes, but revealing a pattern of negligence and greed that implicated half the board she once commanded. Karen didn't just lose her presidency. She lost everything: her standing, her influence, her future. Her house, the pristine, beige-painted monument to her delusions of grandeur, went up for sale within a month, the for sale sign pockmarked with graffiti before it even hit Zillow. No one mourned her departure. There were no farewell parties, no tearful goodbyes, just a collective exhale, like a pressure valve finally releasing years of pent-up resentment. As she packed her U-Haul in the early dawn light, a handful of neighbors watched from their porches, arms folded, silent. Karen didn't look at us, didn't wave, didn't dare. She climbed into the cab, slammed the door, and drove away without a backward glance. I stood on my porch, sipping coffee from my favorite mug, feeling the weight of it all settle over me. Not heavy, but righteous. This wasn't the end. Not yet. There was still one more move to make. One final strike, to ensure that no one ever again mistook silence for submission in this neighborhood. Justice wasn't about punishing Karen. It was about restoring something better in her place. About planting something strong and resilient where her rot had once taken root. The trap was set, the hammer had fallen, but the best was still to come. And Karen Whitmore, wherever she was running to, would soon learn that you can't outrun the consequences forever. The courthouse smelled like old paper and older grudges, a heavy stale air that clung to the marble walls and buzzed fluorescent lights. I sat there in the second row, hands folded loosely, my breathing slow, my mind razor-sharp. Karen Whitmore was 10 feet in front of me, her once pristine posture wilted into something brittle and twitchy, like a porcelain doll with hairline cracks spidering down the middle. She wore a cheap black pantsuit now, the kind meant to whisper, innocent, but only managed to scream, defendant. Her attorney, some junior shark fresh out of law school, shuffled through papers desperately, like he could rearrange the facts into something less damning. He couldn't. Nobody could. The evidence was overwhelming, devastating, the kind of airtight case that prosecutors dream about at night and defense attorneys have nightmares about. Videos, photos, eyewitnesses, financial records, forensic reports, tax documents showing fraud, fire marshal reports confirming deliberate arson. And at the center of it all, Karen's brittle, gasping denials, unraveling on the stand, under oath, trapped by her own lies. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors lined the benches, arms crossed, jaws tight, some openly glaring at her. Reporters hunched over their notebooks, the scratching of their pens like the hiss of snakes. The judge, an old man with steel-gray hair and eyes that looked like they had seen every sin imaginable, leaned forward with a sigh that carried the weight of the entire proceeding. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, voice cutting through the room like a guillotine's blade, "this court finds you guilty on all counts. Criminal mischief, attempted arson, reckless endangerment, fraud, and perjury." Karen whimpered, a pitiful wet sound that made the bailiff shift uncomfortably. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "this court orders a civil judgment against you totaling $1.3 million, payable to the plaintiffs for damages, legal fees, and punitive restitution. $1.3 million. The number dropped like a bomb. Karen's mouth opened and closed, her hands fluttering at the edges of her lap as if trying to grab invisible lifelines. There were none. Her assets, frozen. Her reputation, incinerated. Her empire of HOA tyranny, reduced to ash and scattered to the wind. The judge banged his gavel once, sharp and final, and just like that, it was over. No grand speeches, no last-minute reprieve, just the cold execution of justice. Karen was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, her eyes wide and glassy, mascara tracking like bruises down her cheeks. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply stood, buttoned my jacket, and walked calmly into the sunlight, the last chain around my neighborhood snapping cleanly behind me. The fallout was immediate and glorious. The HOA board, already gutted by resignations and scandal, dissolved within 2 weeks under state investigation. Auditors picked through their finances like vultures stripping a carcass, finding so many violations that even the county's legal department was considering broader criminal charges against the remaining members. Karen's house, her precious, meticulously landscaped shrine to her own ego, went into foreclosure when she couldn't meet the legal judgments piling against her like a wall of tombstones. It sat abandoned for a month, the grass growing wild, the shutters sagging like drooping eyelids, a rotting tooth at the center of what had once been her kingdom. Then came the auction. I showed up anonymously, hidden behind a bland shell company I had formed months earlier for this exact purpose. The bidding started slow, a few cautious investors sniffing around the carcass. I waited, silent, patient, a predator in the grass. When the time was right, I struck, an offer too strong, too clean, too final for anyone else to challenge. When the gavel dropped, it was mine. Karen's house, her throne, her symbol of dominion now belonged to me. I didn't move in. I didn't renovate. I didn't sell. I bulldozed it. I hired demolition crews who treated the project like a public execution, tearing down every smug stone, every manicured shrub, every self-satisfied corner of her domain. Neighbors gathered to watch. Some clapped. Some cried. Some simply stood in stunned silence as the last physical monument to her reign crumbled into dust. And then, where her front porch once stood, I built something better. A park. Not a playground littered with corporate logos and HOA sponsorships, but a real, simple, joyful place. Wide green lawns, shady oak trees, benches carved from fallen timber. A small playground with old-fashioned swings and a slide that gleamed silver in the sun. And right at the entrance, mounted on a heavy iron plaque, I had a single sentence engraved: "Freedom from tyranny, for every neighbor who dared to hope." It became a rallying point, a symbol. The first and last nail in the coffin of what the HOA had once been. The community voted overwhelmingly, 92%, to abolish the HOA altogether. The old bylaws were shredded in a bonfire that smelled like fresh paper and long overdue freedom. No more petty fines. No more lawn. Nazis measuring grass height with rulers. No more letters taped to doors like ransom notes. Just neighbors, human beings, living side by side in mutual respect, not under the cracked whip of false authority. On the first official day the park opened, the laughter of children echoed through the neighborhood like a song we had all forgotten the words to. Parents sipped coffee on benches. Dogs chased frisbees across the open fields. Grandparents strolled under the fresh canopy of trees, nodding to each other with the slow, grateful recognition of survivors. And me? I sat on my porch, my real porch, my free porch, sipping black coffee and watching the life I had fought for unfold in front of me. No anger, no bitterness, just a deep, resonant peace. Justice, real justice, isn't loud. It doesn't need banners or parades. It settles into the bones like good soil around strong roots. It restores what was stolen. It rebuilds what was broken. It makes tyrants into footnotes and cowards into cautionary tales. Karen Whitmore would never set foot here again. Her name would fade from the town records like ink left too long in the sun, a warning for future generations carved only in the memories of those who lived through her reign. But the laughter of children, the murmur of families gathering without fear, the simple act of neighbors waving to each other over backyard fences, that would last forever. That was my real victory. Not the lawsuits, not the judgments, not even the park. It was the restoration of something that tyrants like Karen always underestimate and can never truly destroy: hope. As the sun dipped low behind the trees and the playground filled with golden light, I leaned back, took a slow sip of coffee, and smiled, not because I had won, but because the war was finally, undeniably, gloriously over.